I'm Ethan Wittrock with Instructional Technology. I'm one of the instructional technology specialists that help to incorporate technology assignments into the curriculum. And Sarah?
Hi, my name is Sarah Gewirtz, and I'm the social science librarian. And Ethan and I together, thank you for coming to our presentation. This session will discuss how we designed a single session technology assignment as a way for faculty to introduce aspects of information literacy to their students. And then please feel free to ask any questions at any point in our presentation today. So what we want to start with is just kind of giving you some history or background about the partnership between the libraries and instructional technology. So prior to March 2018, academic instructional technology was known as media services. Media services was part of the libraries where they helped with event setups, material ordering, reserving materials, yet very little teaching for technology. In July 2015, a digital media support specialist was hired to reach out to faculty to discuss assigning video production projects to their students. These sessions were originally taught by media services staff, but with an influx of classes in the last few years, librarians were asked to get involved. Since March 2018, librarians have committed time to learning video, podcasts, and 3D printer technology so that they teach sessions. The instructional technologists know the technology, whereas librarians know information literacy. So I would say there was a disconnect between the information, that literacy aspect that we knew, and the technology that they knew. And so we decided to talk to each other and work together, since instructional technologists knew the technology, we knew the information literacy, and information literacy had been a key piece missing from the sessions, which everyone felt needed to be incorporated. Each party was committed to learning from each other, but also inspiring each other while changes to teaching and classroom structure occurred. So during the last 2 years now, librarians have become involved with the design of media projects to help add an information literacy component to the project. So it goes beyond just teaching the technology. Learning outcomes originally designed for librarians to use discussing assignment faculty now include media components, are used by both libraries and instructional technologists. And that's the first link that's in the chat is to our learning outcomes. We've also been working together each semester to assess projects and have used a rubric that we also designed as a group, and that is the second link in the chat. Learning sequences that outline what was involved with video, podcast, 3D, as well as other media projects were developed in 2019 to help guide discussion between faculty, librarians, and instructional technologists. That is the third link in the chat. And this summer, we won the Minnesota Library Association Innovator Award because of our learning sequences. Furthermore, librarians and instructional technologists are looking over past assignments to create a menu that will be available to faculty to help them get ideas if they want to incorporate a media element into their assignments. We're also beginning to reach out to faculty who are teaching the CSB identity courses to see if they would be interested in adding a media project. So in regards to creating this assignment, in the summer of 2019, Ethan and I were tasked with creating assignments with the new integrations curriculum in mind. One assignment that we created was this for against control assignment. The goal of the assignment was to have students gain information literacy skills, but also develop their critical thinking skills when reviewing sources, whether for a research paper or from the news. Students were divided into groups and given pre-recorded video audio content. They were then given an perspective and asked to selectively edit a short piece together to advocate for or against or be neutral of the topic. And then those that are assigned to remain neutral were asked to present the information as balanced as possible. When reviewing the finished projects, the assigned perspectives for each group remained a secret, and the students were asked to guess the intended tilt of each piece. We specifically used clips from the Iraq War since we knew that students had no idea what the war was about. So it left any possibility of their own personal views or opinions through when creating the video. Ethan and I have discussed more recent news stories for this to see how well students do with that information. So since this was a new assignment, we were interested in testing our first run as an exercise rather than a graded assignment. Professor Ellen Block, who teaches the transnational anthropology, has her students produce a short documentary over the span of the semester. In spring 2020, before the pandemic hit, we used the For Against Neutral project in our class as a precursor to their larger documentary assignment. And now Ethan's going to show you a short video that highlights the project.
So as Sarah mentioned, our first run of this was kind of incorporating it as an exercise. So we used it a little bit differently than I think we would probably encourage using it. We'd encourage using it as a complete standalone. The idea was to try and condense what was a 2-week process quite frequently when it came to like a video assignment in a class down to 1 or 2 sessions. And the way you do that essentially is you cut everything you possibly can down to its essence. So how we cut a 2-week project down into 1 was to make it a flipped classroom. They watched the videos ahead of time. They were given the assignment ahead of time. All of that work was done by the students at the faculty members' discretion as far as giving access to the information and giving access to the resources. We as librarians and instructional technologists can be there for that introductory session, but it's not absolutely vital. That second session was the major one, and or the main session, which was the time that they were already given their angle, they were able to review the content, and they were able to start selectively editing it in a way that then would demonstrate that they were either for, against, or trying to remain as neutral and as balanced as possible in the coverage. So here's the example of that. It is worth mentioning that we used it in this specific context to test their editing skill sets for a larger documentary that they were working on throughout a semester. It wasn't done as a standalone assignment. And so there's references to that as well. So here I'll share my screen and we'll pull up the video here. In spring semester of 2020, about a month before the closure due to COVID-19, Instructional Technology and the Libraries worked with a class on their very first For Against Neutral assignment. In this specific case, we used the assignment as an exercise to teach and prove editing skill sets for a larger assignment.
My name is Ellen Block, and I am an associate professor in the sociology department, and I'm an anthropologist. I use this assignment for my transnational anthropology class. Over the course of the whole semester, the students make a documentary film that gets presented on Scholarship and Creativity Day. And it's a class that looks at transnational people's experiences. It's a lot about migrating groups that are present in Minnesota. What they're trying to do is tell a story about some transnational experience or issue.
Before they started working on their documentary, students took part in the For Against Neutral assignment as an exercise to test their editing skill sets. Using the Vanderbilt Television News Archive available through the library's database collections, we were able to use Iraq War coverage as the basis for the assignment. Students were asked to selectively edit the clips in a way that appeared for, against, or remaining neutral to the question of the justification of the invasion of Iraq based upon the presence of nuclear weapons.
David, as you know, the Vice President of the United States and Secretary of State Powell say, we still don't know the end result. We could still find these weapons.
Well, Tom, let me explain how I came to a different conclusion. If there are large stockpiles of weapons, there must have been a production process which required plants, required people, and it would have produced documentation. But we have seen nothing that would indicate large-scale production.
And what that shows them is that any sort of body of footage, like the ones that they're taking for their own projects, can be turned to tell a narrative in multiple different ways. And it's really important to understand that because the students have a responsibility to represent the people that they are telling this story about in the way that would feel true to them.
Using very basic editing techniques, students were able to change the specific message of each individual interview if they chose to.
Saddam Hussein had the intention of having weapons of mass destruction, had weapons of mass destruction programs, had weapons which he had used in the past, and we believed he had every possibility of having such weapons in the present. Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, weapons which he had used in the past, and we believed he had every possibility of having such weapons in the present. Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, weapons which he had used in the past, and we believed he had every possibility of having such weapons in the present.
This became especially apparent to students during the review session at the end, and also helped create a flag of what the motivation of the specific piece might be. However, most of the students were not aware that some of the B-roll that was provided was actually not related to the war in Iraq, but was instead stock footage of Iran. Using these images on top of manipulated interviews, they were able to create compelling arguments of misrepresented information.
I really hope students took away from this project that context really matters. You can't just take something out of context and use it for whatever ends you want. You need to embed it in its context. How you tell someone's story really matters. And this video project really shows that, because the results based on the groups are totally different. And so it really shows that, you could support something or show something totally different. And especially in this current day in political context, we know that data can be manipulated, news stories can be told in a certain way, and it can create falsehoods and partisanship. So it's really important. This video assignment shows them the responsibility they have in crafting their narrative.
After having used a version of this assignment in several cases, we've realized that an important component of the assignment is to have a conversation about information and media literacy and the ethical use of information. Please consider the joint learning outcomes recommended by Instructional Technology and the Libraries as a guide to consider incorporating one of these aspects into this assignment. Other considerations for improving the assignment or making it so that it was scalable for a range of different classes include changing the topic, modifying the pre-recorded content, or considering an alternative medium, such as an audio podcast.
I think this type of assignment could be developed to use in lots of different classes. I think there's a lot of faculty members that do podcasts, and I think there could be a similar assignment crafted for podcasts that doesn't use video but uses audio clips, and showing that you could take audio clips to, manipulate a story to different ends and kind of get that same message across. I think it also might be good to have a newer, a more recent example of something that you could tell in multiple different ways, because then students would have their own knowledge about it to bring to the assignment.
The for against neutral assignment has typically been done as a single session flipped classroom assignment. In this sense, it's never focused on helping students become masters of video production or audio editing. Instead, it is our hope that students will think critically, creatively, and with complexity about what it means to create and consume information and media in their world today.
This kind of assignment really connects to a liberal arts education because it brings in lots of different skill sets and a sort of interdisciplinary approach to real life examples. That's what the liberal arts can do for us. It gives us all the ability to think critically and contextually about different things from all these different angles and then apply them to real life. So I think this is a really great example of how an assignment can teach students to do that. So it was a really valuable addition to the liberal arts.
So Ellen's class, as we kind of mentioned, took place in spring of 2020, so right before COVID hit in full force. And so it kind of derailed a little bit of our plans as far as rolling this out as a video assignment or as a video exercise for other classes. But we did end up trying it again with an audio podcast class. And we learned a lot, I think, through the process, that in some cases there was a way to make it more effective, if we had maybe changed the rules of the assignment or changed the content that we gave them ahead of time. But the video one, I think in general, actually worked as well as we could have hoped for a first run of things. There's always opportunities to improve on a process to make an assignment like this, I think, more effective or more pertinent to the specific major or the specific topic that the instructor wants to talk about. It's certainly something, though, that if given a little bit of time ahead of time, prep time, that content could be created and ready to go for this type of an assignment. So yeah, since then, our plans have been a bit derailed or postponed at least. But then we did the audio podcast using Zoom, and we used breakout sessions to make it so that student groups were able to meet in their small breakout rooms. And then I and Sarah jumped in between the different breakout rooms to help provide support for what is a freeware, Audacity, audio editing software, that everyone was able to download for free, everyone was able to use without issue, and we made the content available via OneDrive. So that at least made it so that we could move from needing to be in the Kling Media Lab in the Learning Commons to you can be anywhere on the planet, and we could technically still conduct this assignment and meet in real time to troubleshoot issues that might come up. Still a rough hewn, needs a little bit of work, but in concept, it can be done. So here are some of the major takeaways that we realized after doing the project as a video assignment and as an audio podcast. Having the pre-recorded content loaded on hard drives or on OneDrive ahead of time noticeably sped up the process. So in a traditional audio podcast, or especially in a traditional video project, students would be responsible for creating essentially all of their content. They would have to go, they would be top production, so they could go out and record interviews, go and record stock footage, go and record a number of different things that they would then bring back to edit and put together. Well, that, depending on the learning outcomes of the specific assignment or the, you know, that the faculty member is looking for, that might be a step that can be overlooked. You can focus instead on the unique voice that these students have in the editing process, giving them instead pre-recorded content, as in the case of the for against neutral assignment. And as I mentioned, that sped up the process enough where we could do it in a 1 or a 2 shot versus in a 1 or a 2 week. Assigning groups their angles ahead of time before reviewing the pre-recorded content helped them identify clips that supported their argument. So I think this was something we did with the video class, but we didn't do with the audio class, was they had access to the content at least a day or so before we got together to actually edit them in real time. And that gave them a chance to view everything that we had given them. You saw the clip of Colin Powell and of Tom Brokaw and things like that. It gave them a chance to look through that, to figure out what was going to be supportive of a for, what was going to be supportive of an against, how they might balance things out to try and appear as neutral as possible before they got the angle. So then I think they were given the angle at the beginning of the class, but they had already reviewed the footage, and it made it more effective because they knew what they were looking for right away. Otherwise, I think that can be a bit of a stall. Reviewing videos or audio podcasts during the same class kept the momentum and energy high and made it possible to do do everything as a single or as a 2-shot class. So that also sped up the process. Normally we would say, oh, well, let's do a review session of the project after a 2-week class, and that itself ends up being its own standalone class. But because these are so short, and because you're talking about probably like a 1 to 3 minute piece that they're creating, if you can take an 80-minute class, possibly shorter, but 80-minute would be ideal, and actually allow for that last 20 minutes to be time to review those sessions or to review those clips and see if students can guess if they're for, against, or if they're neutral. That I think ends up being a really good way to keep the momentum going for this type of an exercise. Depending on the relevancy of topic, context was needed. So I don't know why this surprised me, but of course we did something on the Iraq War, and very few of the students had much recollection or understanding of the historical context of it. So like we had to explain, for example, that at the time there was a lot of pressure based upon the thought that there were nuclear weapons present. And they, if they had had a bit more of that context or a bit more of that history, or if we picked a topic that was perhaps a bit more relevant or more timely, they probably wouldn't have run up against that as noticeably. But that was actually a leg, again, in I think that specific assignment where there was a few that, raised their hand and flagged us over and asked us a specific question that we thought might be maybe common knowledge, but I think it's all about who's common knowledge. So that was something that we would give consideration to, and maybe it would be appropriate to do a topic that's specific to campus, but not necessarily overtly political, given the idea that it wouldn't necessarily come with a lot of their own biases, and they could instead see how the method of selective editing was able to then make it divisively toward, for, against, or neutral. That being said, I think it can be done with political content, and probably needs to be, at least on some level. Given the circumstances of the time we live in, this type of an assignment in part is to help foster that critical thinking, is to help foster that idea of like, okay, what's the angle of the presenters that are giving you this information? So in that sense, there is not necessarily any sort of strong recommendation on our end to say like, oh, you have to do something on the effectiveness of recycling, or you should be doing something that's very timely, that's in the news cycle currently. I think that either could be done. I will say that as far as a content rights and legality perspective is concerned, we had full educational rights to use the Vanderbilt Television News Archive, which was great. Sometimes once you start venturing into something that maybe is a little bit more immediate, we would just want to make sure to do the prep work ahead of time to make sure that we had full clearance to use whatever it was. Normally these things don't see the light of day, so it's not entirely as concerning as something that might be, as you saw with Colin Powell, cut in such a way that it fully changes the message. It completely changes the message. And if something like that is to be sent out, it's sort of like teaching them how to make dynamite and then being surprised when something blows up. So we're wanting to, I think, avoid, setting expectations that all of a sudden once things become distributed on social media, that it's problematic. Conversations about the ethics of news coverage, journalism, information literacy, I think are a needed part of this assignment or of this exercise. It could be done as the secondary session, the session after the fact, to sort of follow up and sort of be a closer to this assignment. But I think it's very necessary, because one of the things that we noticed, especially with the video assignment, was at the very end of the video assignment, students had a lot of really good questions. They were asking things like, this has to be illegal, right? I mean, this is illegal. It's illegal to change someone's message so drastically that it completely is unrecognizable compared to what we all saw was the original content. And we had to leave it there. I think that it's fantastic to see the students coming to a point of their ability to question what they're seeing. But I think for them to become cynical or closed off to the idea of you can't trust anything is also itself damaging. So it's important, I think, to have that conversation as part of this type of an assignment. And we have some guides on what that might look like, but having a librarian or having our team involved in some way, I think would be a good way to address it as well. We played the videos and audio podcasts at the end of the class and had them guess the angle. I think this was actually one of the best parts of the assignment, was the fact that they didn't technically know which group had which. They might have had an inkling, but for the most part, because it was all the same content that they were working with, they didn't actually 100% know. They're like, well, gosh, was that the one Sarah was working on, or was that the one Miranda was working on? They had to guess. And that is where we noticed pretty distinctively, they had a hard time identifying what was trying to be neutral, what was trying to be balanced. And that itself, I think, is probably a good conversation to have. So they normally would be able to be like, that's leaning this way, that's leaning the other way. But they did have a harder time trying to find something that was just presenting the information as objectively or as balanced as possible. It was slightly less effective for the audio podcast. I think that one of the things we've learned doing this is that, you have to experiment to figure out if it works. You have to sort of throw things at the wall and see what sticks sometimes. But the audio podcast, what we did is we stripped the audio from the interviews that we had done for the video class, but it's not exactly the same thing, is it? We even added an additional, I think, news package, just so that they had enough content to work with and some sound effects to work with. But we didn't give them narration. And so because we didn't give them any sort of like something to stitch it all together, they had to use their own. Well, it's pretty hard for them to appear a little bit more subtle about their approach to whether or not it's for, against, or neutral when they're flat out writing part of a script to kind of stitch these things together. So we would kind of maybe rethink that portion of the assignment a little bit better. I do think it probably works better as a video assignment, in the sense that they're able to use stock photos, stock footage, and that they're able to play to the visual aspects of these pieces that are being said. Because if I say that there's no weapons, and all of a sudden I'm showing people walking around with weapons, it's a different, I think it's a different method of persuasion in some ways than if we were just using the audio. So, and doing all of this via Zoom was slightly tricky. So the audio podcast content would need to be given additional consideration and to make the assignment more successful. In the one time that we tried it, it was fall of 2020, and there was a noticeable difference in the methods used to stitch the ideas together without showing clear motive. And it was less effective ultimately without the use of stock images and B-roll. But navigating the use of technology was also a little bit more challenging when they were on the Zoom call versus when they were in person. When they were in person, we could walk over to them when they raised their hand. There is ways to, if you had enough, I think, staff on hand to do it during a Zoom call, you can jump between those breakout sessions and still support it. You can still help them with a screen share option to make sure that everything's working just fine with Audacity. But I think it needs to be cleaned up just a little bit. Still doable. I think through the end of it, though, we found ourselves realizing that there is something to this assignment. And there's certainly something to pre-recorded content, video assignments or podcast assignments, because the students' voices still were very distinctive. Even though they hadn't produced necessarily, especially in the video case, even though they hadn't produced any narration, they hadn't recorded anything for themselves, they hadn't produced anything. They had just edited what had been given to them. No one piece was especially, similar to the others. They had chosen to edit them without much direction in a completely different way from the other groups. And so in this respect, their voices still really came through simply a selective editing process. And when the election cycle and things like that came around in fall of 2020, we were talking about how, there was an article with Minnesota Public Radio talking about where are all the deep fakes. And it boiled down to a simple reality. They said, well, simple editing techniques are cheaper, easier, and still very, very effective. And selective editing in this respect, removing the context or putting it within a different context, made it so it was very easy to still get by without having to do CGI, computer animation, or things like this to make it appear like someone was saying something that they hadn't. You can do that with basic cut and paste iMovie. You can use Photos, which is an app on any of your PC laptops, to basically do the very simple editing that we were doing with this assignment. So it means that everyone has access to these tools, and drawing a command and an understanding of how to use them effectively and ethically was an important part of the motivation for us designing an assignment like this. So that's all I have for for our portion. I was curious if there's any questions that you have about this type of an assignment. It doesn't need to be necessarily specific to the for, against, neutral. It could just be a pre-recorded content assignment of whether or not it's something that you'd be interested in trying in your class, either as an exercise or as an assignment. I will post the link to that video here in the chat. Please feel welcome to use that. I think we have permission to make that public. I'm going to confirm that one. But in the meantime, though, you have access to the link. It's an unlisted link. So, Sarah, anything I missed that we still want to chat a bit about here?
I don't think so. Thank you, Ethan.
Yeah, open to your questions.
That was really powerful. And I'm thinking I would love to do something like that in like food, especially like related to food systems and food policies and hunger. I don't know necessarily, like you said, like not necessarily for, against, or neutral, but I guess kind of that, again, our information. Oh, geez. Yeah, I guess, looking at where are our sources and where, what voice do we still have? And I guess talking as I'm thinking. I don't necessarily have a class or assignment, but I love this idea, and I'd love to, I guess, circle back on it.
Food and nutrition would be a perfect one, to tell you the truth. My father-in-law teaches the LIFE program through Centricare, and the talk about essentially the misinformation campaigns that often surround a lot of different industries when it comes to food. And it would be pretty easy, actually, to compile a certain amount of pre-recorded content to that end. So if there was interest in doing something like that, I know a guy who could probably point us toward a range of different resources, but I think faculty-wise too would have, I'm sure, a wealth of knowledge of what resources that are kind of very tilted to a very specific angle. It needs to sort of be revealed to students how easily that's done. So that it's not being used in a way that is misleading to them. So no, I think there is no requirement for it to be something as controversial or as consequential as something like a war. It can be done, I think, on very simple things, because it often is. It's often, I mean, when it comes to things like advertisements, there's a motive, and for students to always be aware of those things is a helpful part of, I think, that information literacy component. So.
Yeah.
So you feel welcome to reach out to us and talk about what it might look like. But I think food would be and nutrition would be a fantastic one.
Yeah, I think I have to think realistically about what I'm teaching in the future, because like obviously, like you said, I would I don't know if upcoming with Zoom is the best outlook, but yeah, planning ahead. I appreciate it. I'm going to make note of this. You say war, it doesn't necessarily have to be war, but historically, the war on hunger, that is like basically war, and poverty is so it's such a huge part of like food security and stuff. And so I think could really look at it from that angle. Thank you. I'll
there would be a way to do this assignment as a video. I think it would just need to be that the students are ideally using their own devices, or that they're accessing our editing lab. Nursing was able to fully do an entire video assignment last semester during fall of 2020. And they had to be somewhat agile as things came up. There were certain situations in which student groups are fully quarantined, but they were able to get by using either their personal devices, using their personal editing softwares. There's definitely a way to do it. I guarantee that everyone on this call right now has some basic video editing software on their device. And so if that's the case, I think it's just a matter of making sure that it's simple enough that the selective editing process is more cut and paste rather than it is using transitions and animations and things that would maybe bog down some of the older models. But doing the basics, we can design an assignment that is bring your own device based. And even if if we want to try doing it as a podcast, it's just going to take a little bit more forethought to make sure that it's robust enough and that it addresses those learning outcomes. So.
And Laura, I was thinking too, you could use this like Ellen did as get them comfortable with the media technology part of it, but then have them create maybe PSAs or something like that with the after just learning how to use Final Cut Pro to create their video. We can sit down with you and talk about, well, here's an assignment that might be really helpful for them to do and real creative and something different for your class and stuff. And that way there's a tie-in in that respect too.
Cool, thank you.
Other questions about these or other types of assignments? Feel welcome.
Well, it's a really great assignment. I can see how it would help a lot with critical thinking. Did the students, when they were for or against, actually use the material in misleading ways purposefully? And that was part of the assignment, that they were expected to do that?
Yes.
Okay. So not just put kind of an emphasis on the truth, but truly be misleading.
It could be done in a way that's
Sure.
just subtle, if that makes so that it's a little bit less explicit, like which angle they were were given.
Right.
We essentially told them, like, you can't outright say I'm against, you can't outright say I'm for, but use it in any way you choose to in order to prove your point. And in that respect, it's kind of defense against the dark arts type stuff. I mean, we're teaching them bad stuff, but it's so that the creating of that helps them understand the consumption of that. And
Absolutely.
And that, I think, was an important aspect of the assignment. But boy, when we did the reviews, showing at the end, there's a few students that were like, that's not what he said. And, or that's not even close to what he said. He chopped it up in such a way that it became unrecognizable, or they covered it up with photos or with B-roll. And all of a sudden you couldn't see any of the edits that were made, any of those cuts that were made. So no, they were essentially told, manipulate, use this content, manipulate it in such a way that it becomes, divisively beneficial to your stance. And it was kind of troubling to watch, to be honest.
Right.
But,
well, that I suppose is why you have the ethics assignment or ethics discussion at the end, because that would be really important. I
think that is a major piece that needs to be added. I mean, we did it, but we brushed on it. And, there's a temptation, I think, that just teaching it would make them a little bit cynical rather than thinking it through to its conclusion. So I definitely would say that that's a part of it that without it, it's kind of without it, I think it's a little bit of a hollow assignment. But I think if we can attach those very intentional conversations about ethics, information literacy, it becomes a very, I think, a very complementary aspect of any field. I mean, you got to figure, regardless of its nutrition or whether it's ethics of war or whether it's, whatever it may be, those students are now thinking about it, at least in that moment, a little bit more intentionally.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Ethan. I mean, the intent of the assignment isn't necessarily to make them go, well, I can't trust anything anymore. Everything's skewed or whatever, but it's to get them to hopefully just think critically about the information that they're reading and get them to understand that, you could go to CNN for your news, but how about consider you going to go to Fox News, see what their point of view is on the topic, or read the New York Times and see what their view might be on that particular topic. It's important to, to have a better understanding of the topic. You need to look at multiple sources in order to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think we talked a bit too about how the difference between maybe journalism and research as being maybe a part of that conversation. Because I know that students are often using things like journalistic pieces in their maybe essays, regardless of the field that they're in, where there is a difference between these. And I think it helps maybe students to have a practical application for the constructs of authority, or for that matter, information that's maybe been vetted or fact checked a bit more than if it's just conjecture or anecdote. And in that sense, it's very maybe a precursor to maybe even a larger assignment. If someone was interested in doing something like that, that's not off the table by any means. I mean, this is actually kind of the normal things that we would often do, is some of those larger podcast assignments or video assignments. And in some respects, this can just sort of be that introduction to that larger set of questions about everything from permission, privacy, intellectual property, and any of our joint learning outcomes. Well, great. If there aren't any other questions, we also, like I said, put the links in the chat. Some of that information is, if not all of it, is actually on our website. But you can also reach out to Sarah or I or any of our colleagues in the Libraries or Instructional Technology to talk about these and other types of assignments. I think one of the things we hope you take away from this is that we're very open to experimenting. It's not nothing set in stone as far as what's on the menu. This is a new assignment. It's less than a year old. So in that sense, we're certainly open to having conversations about what it might look like to customize something or to make something completely new. So.
Definitely.
So thank you so much for being here today. Well, being here, being where you are, and tuning in for this conversation. We appreciate it.